The thunder over the Wyoming plains that night sounded like cannon fire, shaking the very timber of the solitary ranch house. But it wasn't the storm that made Jedediah Vance reach for the loaded Winchester, leaning against his mantle. It was the frantic, hollow thudding against his front door. He didn't expect visitors. Men like Jed didn't get visitors. He expected trouble. Yet, when he threw back the heavy oak latch, he didn't find a bandit or a marshal. He found a shivering little girl, hardly 10 years old, rain plastering her hair to her skull. Behind her, a horse stood trembling, carrying a slump of a figure. "Can we sleep in your barn?" the girl whispered, her voice cracking. Jed didn't know it yet, but saying yes would bring a war to his doorstep and force him to dig up a past he had buried 6 feet deep. The wind howled across the plains of Bitter Creek, a desolate stretch of Wyoming territory that God seemed to have created on a bad day. It was 1884, a time when the law was often just a suggestion, and a man's property line was defined by the range of his rifle. Jedediah Vance sat in his armchair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. The fire in the hearth was dying down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn log walls. Jed was a man carved from granite and regret. At 50 years old, his beard was flecked with grey, and his eyes, the colour of cold steel, held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much blood during the Civil War, and even more in the years that followed. He lived alone on the Rocking V Ranch, a sprawling 3,000 acres of scrub grass and dust. The townsfolk in nearby Cody whispered that Jed had a heart of stone, that he'd sooner shoot a man than shake his hand. They weren't entirely wrong. The storm outside was a monster, lashing rain against the roof like handfuls of gravel. Jed took a sip of the whiskey, enjoying the burn when he heard it. It was faint at first, lost under the roar of the wind, but then it came again, a desperate, rhythmic pounding on the heavy oak door. Jed didn't move quickly. He moved with the calculated efficiency of a predator. He set the glass down, picked up the Winchester Model 1873, and levered around into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack was loud in the quiet room. He walked to the door, standing to the side of the frame, an old habit from days when opening a door could earn you a bullet in the gut. "Who's there?" his voice rumbled, deep and gravelly. "Please!" A voice, thin and terrified, barely audible over the gale. "Please, mister!" Jed frowned. He unlatched the door and kicked it open. The wind surged in, nearly extinguishing the oil lamp on the wall. Standing on his porch, soaked to the bone, was a child. She wore a dress that had once been blue calico, but was now stained with mud and grease. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, and her teeth chattered violently. But it was her eyes that caught Jed off guard. They were blue, terrified, and desperate. "Can we sleep in your barn?" she asked, shouting over the wind. "Please, we won't touch nothing, just the barn." Jed narrowed his eyes, looking past her. "We?" The girl pointed a trembling finger toward the yard. A horse, a roan mare that looked ridden near to death, stood with its head low. Slumped over the saddle was another figure, motionless. Jed lowered the rifle slightly but didn't uncock it. "Who's that?" "My sister," the girl sobbed. "She's hurt bad. Please, mister, the man is coming." That phrase, "the man is coming," triggered something in Jed. It was a primal alarm. He looked out into the darkness. The storm obscured everything beyond the porch, but he felt the weight of the girl's fear. It was a tangible thing. "Get her inside," Jed barked, stepping out into the rain. He didn't send them to the barn. He strode past the girl, grabbing the mare's reins. The woman on the horse was unconscious, her breathing shallow. Jed pulled her down with a strength that belied his age. She was light, too light. He carried her into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind the little girl. "Over there," Jed commanded, nodding toward a cot in the corner of the room. He laid the woman down. She looked to be in her early 20s, with the same fair features as the girl, though her face was pale as milk. A dark stain had bloomed across the side of her traveling coat. "She's been shot," Jed stated. It wasn't a question. He peeled back the coat. A bullet had grazed her ribs, a messy flesh wound, bleeding heavily but likely not fatal if treated. The little girl stood by the fire, shivering, water pooling around her worn boots. She watched Jed with wide, fearful eyes. "What's your name, girl?" Jed asked, grabbing a bottle of alcohol and a clean rag from a cabinet. "Lily," she whispered. "And that's Marion." "I'm Jed," he grunted. "Come here, Lily. Hold this lamp. I need to clean this out." For the next hour, the hardened rancher worked with surprising gentleness. He cleaned the wound, stitched it with the steady hands of a man who had done this 100 times before, and bandaged Marianne's side. Lily held the lamp, flinching every time the thunder clapped, but she didn't cry. When he was done, Jed threw a heavy wool blanket over Marion and turned to the girl. "You hungry?" Lily nodded. Jed heated up a pot of beans and salt pork from the stove and cut a thick slice of bread. He watched her eat like a starving wolf. When she was finished, the warmth of the cabin and the fullness of her belly finally overtook her fear. She began to droop. "Take the rug by the fire," Jed said. "I'll take the chair." "Thank you," Lily said, her voice small. "You ain't mean like they said." Jed raised an eyebrow. "Who said?" "The people in town. They said the man at the rocking V is a devil." Jed huffed, a dry, humorless sound. "Sometimes the devil is the only one who can keep the demons away, girl. Now sleep." He settled back into his armchair, the Winchester across his lap. He didn't sleep. He watched the fire, and he listened to the wind. But mostly, he thought about the bullet wound in the woman's side. That was a .45 caliber hole, a peacemaker round. Someone had tried to kill these girls, and if they had ridden this horse into the ground to get here, whoever pulled the trigger wasn't far behind. Jed looked at the sleeping child. He had spent 20 years building walls around his life, shutting out the world. Tonight, in one moment of weakness, he had let the world back in, and he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that come morning, there would be hell to pay. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the Wyoming sky a piercing, innocent blue. The smell of wet sagebrush and mud wafted through the cracks in the cabin logs. Jed was awake before the sun. He had moved to the porch, coffee tin in hand, scanning the horizon. The landscape was empty, rolling hills, the distant purple bruise of the mountains, and the muddy track leading up to his gate. But Jed knew the emptiness was a lie. Trouble didn't disappear with the rain. It just waited for the roads to dry. Inside, he heard stirring. He turned to see Marion, the older sister, sitting up on the cot. She was clutching her side, her face tight with pain. Lily was already awake, crouching beside her, whispering frantically. When Jed stepped inside, Marion's hand flew to her belt. It was empty. "I took your gun," Jed said calmly, taking a sip of coffee. "Smith & Wesson Schofield. Nice piece. Hard to find ammunition for it out here, though." Marion's eyes darted around the room, assessing exits, assessing threats. She had the look of a trapped animal, fierce but cornered. "Where are we?" "Rocking V Ranch," Jed said. "I'm Jedediah Vance. I stitched you up last night. You bled on my good quilt." Marion relaxed slightly. but the tension didn't leave her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. We'll be leaving as soon as I can stand." "You won't get far," Jed said, walking over to the stove to pour another cup of coffee. He held it out to her. "Horse is lame. Rode her too hard. She needs 3 days' rest. Minimum. And you tear those stitches, you'll bleed out before you hit the county line." Marion took the coffee, her hands trembling. "We can't stay here. It's not safe for you." "I decide what's safe on my land," Jed said, his voice dropping an octave. He pulled a wooden chair opposite the cot and sat down, leaning forward. "Now, suppose you tell me why a woman and a child are riding through a thunderstorm with a bullet in their ribs. And don't tell me it was an accident. Accidents don't happen with the hammer cocked." Marion looked at Lily, then back to Jed. She seemed to weigh the cost of the truth against the risk of the lie. "You know the name Coulter?" Jed's eyes narrowed. The name was like a curse in this territory. "Big Jim Coulter. Runs the 888 ranch south of here. Owns half the judges and all the sheriffs." "He's my husband," Marion said. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Jed looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the faint bruising on her wrist, the way she flinched when he moved too fast. "I see," Jed said quietly. "He's not just a rancher," Marion said, her voice gaining strength. "He's a monster. He hurt Lily." Lily looked down at her hands, twisting the hem of her dirty dress. "I told him I was leaving," Marion continued, tears welling in her eyes. "He laughed. He said I belonged to him, just like his cattle. He tried to lock us in the cellar. I fought back. I grabbed his gun. It went off." Jed remained stoic. "Did you kill him?" "I don't know," Marion whispered. "There was blood, a lot of it. We ran. His men, his foreman, a man named Dutch. He saw us leaving. He took a shot. That's how I got this." She touched her side. Jed stood up and walked to the window. Big Jim Coulter. If there was one man in Wyoming you didn't want as an enemy, it was Coulter. He had a private army of hired guns, mostly drifters and ex-convicts who enjoyed their work too much. If Marion had shot Coulter, every bounty hunter from here to Texas would be looking for her. "If Coulter is alive," Jed said, staring at the horizon, "he'll tear this territory apart looking for you. If he's dead, his brother will do it for him." "We just need to get to the train station in Cheyenne," Marion pleaded. "We have family in St. Louis. Please, Mr. Vance, sell us a horse. We'll go." "You'll never make Cheyenne," Jed said bluntly. "Dutch and his boys are trackers. They'll cut sign on that lame mare within 10 miles. "Then what do we do?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Jed turned to look at them. He saw the same fear he had seen in the eyes of refugees during the war. He saw innocents being hunted by greed and cruelty. He could tell them to leave. He could give them a fresh horse, point them east and wash his hands of it. It would be the smart thing to do, the survivor's thing to do. But then he looked at the Schofield revolver sitting on his mantel, the gun Marion had tried to use to protect her little sister. "You stay put," Jed said. "Barn has a loft. It's defensible. If anyone comes, you hide up there." "Why help us?" Marion asked, suspicion clouding her gratitude. "You don't know us. This brings a war to your door." Jed checked the load in his Winchester. "I got a lot of sins to answer for, Mom. Maybe this buys me a few inches of ground out of the fire." He walked to the door, jamming his hat onto his head. "I'm going to hide your trail. Stay inside. Keep the curtains drawn. If you hear shooting, don't come out unless it's me calling your name." Jed spent the next 4 hours working harder than he had in years. He took the lame mare and walked her down the creek bed for 2 miles, doubling back through the rocky scree where hoof prints wouldn't show. He confused the trail, leading it toward the dangerous canyon passes to the west, away from his ranch. It was late afternoon when he returned. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet. As he crested the ridge overlooking his cabin, he froze. Down in the valley, 3 riders were sitting at his gate. Even from this distance, Jed recognized the dusters. They were 888 men, and leading them was a man on a massive black stallion. He wore a derby hat and carried a sawed-off shotgun in a scabbard across his back. Dutch. Jed felt a cold calm settle over him. The trick hadn't worked, or maybe they were just checking every ranch in the grid. Either way, they were here. Jed spurred his horse, riding down the slope, not with haste, but with a casual, deliberate pace. He wanted them to see him coming. He wanted to draw their eyes away from the house. As he approached the gate, Dutch turned his horse. The man had a face like a dried apple, wrinkled and sour, with a scar running through his left eyebrow. "Afternoon, Vance," Dutch called out, his voice like grinding stones. "You're trespassing, Dutch," Jed replied, stopping his horse 10 yards away. His hand rested casually near his hip. "Just being neighborly," Dutch sneered. "We're looking for some lost property. A woman and a kid. Stole a horse. Hurt Mr. Coulter bad." "Don't see no women here," Jed said. "Just me and the cows." Dutch's eyes flicked to the house. "You sure about that, Jed? 'Cause we found fresh tracks near the creek. Looked like they were heading this way before they vanished." "Tracks can be deceiving," Jed said. "Wind plays tricks." Dutch smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Mind if we take a look? Mr. Coulter is offering $1,000 for their return, alive or otherwise." "I mind," Jed said. "I mind a whole lot. This is private land. You got no badge, Dutch." "Turn around." Dutch chuckled, looking at his 2 companions. They were young, edgy, hands hovering over their guns. "You see, boys, old Jed here thinks he's still the terror of the valley. Thinks the war is still on." Dutch turned back to Jed, the smile vanishing. "Mr. Coulter is going to be the law in this territory, Vance. You stand in the way, you get plowed under. Now, step aside, or we'll burn that shack down with you in it." Jed didn't blink. "You can try, but you remember one thing about me, Dutch." "What's that?" "I don't miss." The standoff hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The wind whistled through the fence posts. Inside the cabin, hidden behind the thick logs, Lily squeezed Marion's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. The standoff at the gate stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with the potential for sudden, violent snapping. Dutch stared at Jedediah, his hand hovering over the grip of his revolver. He was a man who thrived on intimidation, on the certainty that most men would fold when faced with the brand of the 888, but looking into Jed's eyes was like looking down a dry well, dark, empty, and uncaring of what fell into it. Dutch spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty boot of his own stirrup. He knew the stories. He knew that Jedediah Vance had held a ridge alone against a platoon of Union soldiers for 3 days during the war. He knew the man had buried a wife and a daughter on this very land and had nothing left to lose. Men with nothing to lose were the most dangerous kind of currency in the West. "Have it your way, Vance," Dutch grunted, slowly moving his hand away from his gun to adjust his hat. "But you're buying yourself a grave. Jim Coulter don't take no for an answer. And he surely don't take kindly to horse thieves harboring his property." "Get off my land," Jed said, his voice flat. Dutch wheeled his horse around. "Let's go, boys. We'll wait for the boss. We'll see how tough old Jed is when the sun goes down." The 3 riders galloped off, cresting the ridge and disappearing into the fold of the hills. Jed didn't holster his rifle. He watched the dust settle, counting the seconds, ensuring it wasn't a faint. Only when the silence of the plains returned, broken only by the cry of a red-tailed hawk, did he turn his horse back toward the cabin. Inside, the atmosphere was brittle. Marian was sitting on the edge of the cot, her face pale as parchment, clutching Lily against her. When Jed walked in, locking the heavy deadbolt behind him, they both flinched. "They're gone," Jed said, leaning the rifle against the wall. "For now." "They'll come back," Marian whispered. "Dutch he's cruel. He enjoys it." "I know what he is," Jed said, moving to the window. He took a thick pine board from a stack in the corner, lumber he had meant to use to fix the porch, and began nailing it across the glass. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the hammer echoed in the small room. "And I know what's coming. That's why we're going to turn this cabin into a fortress." Lily watched him, her blue eyes wide. "Are we going to die, Mr. Jed?" Jed stopped hammering. He looked at the girl. She reminded him so much of his own Sarah. The same button nose, the same inquisitive tilt of the head. Sarah had died of fever 10 years ago, taking the light of the ranch with her. That loss had turned Jed into the ghost he was today. He knelt down, bringing himself to Lily's eye level. His knees cracked, a sound like dry twigs. "Nobody is dying today, Lily. You see these walls? 8-inch ponderosa pine. Bulletproof. You see me? I'm bulletproof too, mostly. But I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" Lily nodded, a small, jerky movement. "I can try." "Good." Jed stood up. "Marian, how's the side?" "It burns," she admitted, "but the bleeding stopped." "Good. Can you load a rifle?" Marian hesitated, then nodded. "My father taught me, before I married Jim." "I'm going to put my spare Henry repeater on the table," Jed instructed. "And 2 boxes of shells. Your job isn't to shoot unless they come through that door. Your job is to keep Lily down and keep that gun loaded for me. Understand?" For the rest of the afternoon, the rocking V became a war camp. Jed worked with a manic intensity. He dragged the heavy oak table to the center of the room, overturning it to create a barricade facing the door. He filled buckets with water from the pump outside, in case of fire, and brought in armfuls of firewood. He checked every chink in the logs, every hinge on the shutters. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the Wyoming sky, Jed cooked. It wasn't a rushed meal. He made a stew with dried beef, potatoes, and onions, thickening the broth with flour. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee. "Eat," Jed commanded, placing bowls on the floor behind the overturned table. "Fear burns energy faster than work. You need strength." They ate in silence, the cabin darkening around them. Jed didn't light the lamp. A light inside would make them silhouettes for a sniper outside. The only illumination came from the dying embers in the hearth, painting their faces in shades of orange and black. "Why?" Marian asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the gloom. She had put her bowl down. "Why do this? You could have handed us over. Dutch might have let you live. Now you're in the middle of a war that isn't yours." Jed chewed slowly, swallowing before he spoke. He looked into the fire, his face unreadable. "I had a family once, Marian. A wife, Martha. A little girl named Sarah." Lily looked up, interested. "Where are they?" "Buried under the cottonwood tree by the creek," Jed said softly. "Winter of 74. The fever came through. The snow was so deep I couldn't get a doctor from Cody. I sat in this chair and watched them burn up. I had all the guns, all the land, all the strength in the world, and I couldn't save them." The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't fearful anymore. It was a shared sorrow. "I spent 10 years waiting to die," Jed continued, "just waiting for a horse to throw me or a winter to freeze me. But death didn't want me. Then you showed up, a little girl asking to sleep in the barn. He looked at Marion, his eyes fierce. A man can't fight the fever. He can't fight God. But this? Men with guns trying to hurt a child? This I can fight. This is a war I can win. Marion reached out and placed her hand over Jed's rough, scarred knuckles. Thank you, Jed. Don't thank me yet, Jed grunted, pulling his hand away gently to check his Winchester. Wait until morning. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it wasn't just the wind. Jed's ears, tuned to the frequencies of danger, picked up the sound of a hoofbeat. Not a gallop. A walk. Someone was circling the house. Get down, Jed whispered, extinguishing the last ember in the fireplace with a splash of water. The room plunged into absolute darkness. They're here, Jed murmured. A voice called out from the darkness, amplified by a megaphone or just strong lungs. It wasn't Dutch. It was a smoother, more cultured voice, dripping with false civility. Jedediah Vance, the voice boomed. This is Sheriff Amos Brady. You're harboring a fugitive and a kidnapper. I have a warrant for the arrest of Marion Coulter. Send her out, and no harm comes to you. Marion gasped. The sheriff. Jim owns him. He's been on Jim's payroll for years. Jed moved to a firing loop he had cut into the window board. Civil matter, Sheriff, he shouted back. No laws broken here. Just a woman escaping a beating. That's for a judge to decide, Jed, the sheriff yelled. Now I have 20 deputized men out here. We don't want to burn you out, but we will if we have to. You have 1 hour to surrender. Jed turned to the women in the dark. The law had arrived. But in Wyoming, the law was often just the will of the richest man written on paper. 1 hour, Jed whispered. That means they're waiting for something. What? Lily asked. For the moon to go behind the clouds, Jed said grimly. That's when they'll come. The hour passed with agonizing slowness. Inside the cabin, the air grew stale and hot. Jedediah moved like a phantom, checking the front door, the back door, and the trap door that led to the root cellar. He positioned Marion behind the barricade with the Henry rifle. If they breach the door, Jed instructed in a low whisper, you shoot anything that isn't me. Don't hesitate. Aim for the chest. The moon was high and bright, a silver dollar in the sky, illuminating the ranch yard in ghostly hues. Then, as Jed had predicted, a bank of heavy storm clouds drifted from the west, swallowing the light. The world outside turned pitch black. Crack! The sound of the first shot was like a whip snap. A bullet smashed into the log wall, inches from the window, sending splinters flying into the room. Stay low, Jed barked. He didn't return fire immediately. He waited. He watched the muzzle flash. Crack! Another shot. This one from the barn loft. They had taken the high ground. Jed raised his Winchester to the firing loop. He breathed in, holding the air in his lungs to steady his aim. He saw the faint spark of a cigarette cherry in the darkness of the barn's upper hay door, a careless mistake by an arrogant hired gun. Jed squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked against his shoulder. A scream echoed from the barn, followed by the sound of a body hitting the wooden floorboards. 1, Jed counted. The yard erupted. Gunfire sparked from the fence line, the trough, and the tree line. Bullets hammered the cabin, thudding into the thick logs. The glass of the windows shattered behind the boarding. It was a chaotic storm of lead. Marion screamed as a bullet punched through a chink in the daubing, smashing a clay pitcher on the shelf. "Keep your head down," Jed roared. He moved to the back window, firing 2 quick shots at a shadow moving toward the porch. The shadow yelped and scrambled back. This was a suppression tactic. They were trying to keep Jed's head down while they moved closer. They wanted to get close enough to throw a torch on the roof. The shingles were dry cedar. They would go up like kindling. "They're trying to burn us," Marion cried, realizing the strategy. "I know," Jed gritted his teeth. "Lily, get the bucket. Wet the blankets. If fire comes through the roof, you smother it. Can you do that?" "Yes," Lily squeaked, scrambling for the water bucket. The gunfire ceased abruptly. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. "Vance!" Sheriff Brady's voice called out again, closer this time. "That was a warning. Next time we use dynamite. Send her out." Jed reloaded his rifle, his fingers moving with practiced dexterity by feel alone. "You bring dynamite to a domestic dispute, Amos? Since when does the county budget afford that?" "Jim Coulter is a generous benefactor to the county," Brady shouted back. "Last chance, Jed. I have a man here who says Marion shot her husband. That's attempted murder. I can't let that slide." "She defended herself," Jed yelled, "and you know it! Send her out, and she gets a fair trial. A trial by Coulter's jury. I'd sooner shoot her myself." A murmur of angry voices floated from outside. They were losing patience. Suddenly, a massive crash shook the cabin. They hadn't used dynamite. They had used a battering ram. A heavy log, swung by 4 men, slammed into the front door. The oak bar holding it strained, the wood groaning in protest. "Back!" Jed shouted, pulling Marion deeper into the room. Crash. The door splintered. One of the hinges popped, metal screeching. Jed leveled his rifle at the door. "Get ready!" Crash. The door flew inward, hanging by one hinge. 2 men rushed the gap, guns blazing. Jed dropped the first one with a shot to the shoulder, spinning him around. The second man fired wildly, the bullet tearing into the floorboards. Marion squeezed the trigger of the Henry. The recoil knocked her back, but the bullet hit the doorframe, sending a shower of wood into the attacker's face. He stumbled back, blinded by debris. "Clear the door!" Dutch's voice roared from outside. A Molotov cocktail, a whiskey bottle stuffed with a burning rag, sailed through the open doorway. It smashed against the far wall, liquid fire splashing across the logs and the curtains. "Fire!" Jed yelled. Lily was there instantly. She dragged a soaking wet wool blanket and threw it over the flames, stomping on it with her small boots. The smoke was instant and choking. Jed didn't look back. He stood in the open doorway, a silhouette of vengeance. He worked the lever of his Winchester, firing rapidly into the yard. Bang, bang, bang. He suppressed the charge, forcing the men back behind the water trough. "Fall back," the sheriff screamed. "He's crazy." Jed kicked the broken door shut and jammed the table against it. He was breathing hard, sweat stinging his eyes. His left arm throbbed. A splinter or a graze, he wasn't sure. The room was filled with acrid smoke. Lily was coughing, her face smeared with soot. Marion was trembling, still clutching the rifle. "Is it over?" Lily coughed. "No," Jed said, moving to the window to peer out. "That was the probe. They wanted to see if we'd break. Now they know we bite." He turned to the women. "But we can't take another assault like that. The door won't hold. And the fire next time, they'll throw it on the roof, where we can't reach it." "So what do we do?" Marion asked, her voice bordering on hysteria. Jed looked at the trap door in the floor. "We leave." "Leave?" Marion looked at him like he was insane. "They have the house surrounded. There are 20 men out there." "They're watching the doors and windows," Jed said, his mind racing. "They aren't watching the earth." He kicked the rug aside and hauled open the trap door. A blast of cool, damp earth air rose up. "This root cellar, it has a drainage tunnel. I dug it myself 5 years ago when the basement flooded. It runs about 50 yards out, dumps into the dry creek bed behind the barn." "A tunnel?" Lily asked, looking into the black hole. "It's tight," Jed warned, "and it's full of spiders. But it comes out behind their line. If we can get to the creek, we can circle around to the canyon." "And then what?" Marion asked. "Then we hunt," Jed said darkly. "We can't defend this house anymore. So we take the fight to them. But first, we need a distraction." Jed grabbed a bottle of kerosene from the shelf. He began splashing it over the furniture, over the curtains, over the floor. "What are you doing?" Marion cried. "If they want a fire," Jed said, lighting a match, "I'll give them a fire. They'll think we burned up inside. It'll buy us time." He dropped the match. The kerosene caught with a whoosh, flames licking up the walls. "Into the hole, now," Jed ordered. Lily went first, sliding into the darkness. Marion followed, coughing in the thickening smoke. Jed took one last look at his home, the cabin he had built with his own hands, the place where he had raised his family. It was just wood and stone. The memories were in his head. He grabbed a satchel of ammunition and dropped into the hole, pulling the trapdoor shut above him. Above them, the fire roared, consuming the past. Below, in the damp dark, they began to crawl toward an uncertain future. They were out of the fortress. Now, they were in the wild. And Jedediah Vance was no longer a rancher defending his home. He was a soldier behind enemy lines. The earth smelled of wet rot, ancient roots, and fear. The drainage tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare, a narrow throat of mud that squeezed them on all sides. Jed crawled first, the satchel of ammunition dragging heavily against his chest. He could hear Marion's labored breathing behind him, and the soft, terrified whimpers of Lily behind her. "Keep moving," Jed whispered into the darkness, his voice echoing dully. "Don't stop. If you stop, the panic sets in." Above them, the muffled roar of the fire was a constant, terrifying vibration in the soil. The heat was beginning to seep down, turning the tunnel into a steamer. Dust trickled from the ceiling, suggesting the structure of the house above was beginning to give way. It took 10 minutes to traverse the 50 yards, but it felt like 10 years. Finally, the air grew fresher, tinged with the scent of sage and night-blooming jasmine. Jed reached the end of the pipe, pushing aside a tangle of dead tumbleweeds that obscured the exit. He slithered out into the dry creek bed, mud slicking his clothes. He turned immediately to help Marion and Lily. When they emerged, they looked like bog creatures, coated in slime, eyes white and wide in the moonlight. "Stay low," Jed commanded. They crouched in the gully. 100 yards away, up the slope, the cabin was an inferno. The flames leaped 30 feet into the air, turning the night sky a bruised purple. Silhouetted against the fire were the men of the posse. They were cheering. "Burn, you witch!" one man shouted, firing his pistol into the air. "They think we're dead," Marion breathed, wiping mud from her eyes. "Let them think it a while longer," Jed said. He pointed toward the cluster of cottonwood trees near the front gate. The posse had tied their horses there, fresh mounts, saddlebags full of supplies, and scabbards holding rifles. "We need horses. We can't walk to the canyon." "There's a guard," Lily whispered, pointing a small finger. Indeed, a lone man was leaning against a tree, smoking a cigarette, watching the fire with bored detachment. "Wait here," Jed said. He didn't check his rifle. He drew a long, bone-handled hunting knife from his boot. Jed moved through the shadows with the silence of a cougar. He used the noise of the collapsing roof to mask his approach. He moved from brush to rock, rock to tree, until he was directly behind the guard. The man never stood a chance. One hand clamped over his mouth, the other moved with grim efficiency. Jed lowered the unconscious man gently to the ground. He hadn't killed him, just put him to sleep with the hilt of the blade against the temple. Jed wasn't a murderer, but he was a soldier. He whistled low, a mimic of a nightjar. Marion and Lily scrambled up the bank and ran to him. "Pick the best mounts," Jed ordered. Check the cinches." They worked fast. Jed chose a sturdy bay gelding for himself. Marion took a nervous black mare, and they found a smaller roan pony for Lily. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold her. As they swung into the saddles, the roof of the cabin finally gave way completely. A massive plume of sparks erupted into the sky, illuminating the entire yard like a flashbulb. In that flash of light, Dutch turned from the fire. His eyes scanned the perimeter, perhaps looking for stragglers. His gaze locked onto the movement by the trees. "There!" Dutch screamed, pointing. "They're at the horses! Get them! Ride!" Jed shouted, slapping the rump of Lily's pony. The 3 horses surged forward, hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. They tore through the open gate, leaning low over the necks of the animals. Behind them, the confusion of the posse quickly turned into a pursuit. Men were scrambling for the remaining mounts, shouting orders, cursing. "Head west!" Jed yelled over the wind. "Toward the Devil's Anvil!" "That's a box canyon!" Marion shouted back. "We'll be trapped! Trust me!" They rode like demons. The wind whipped tears from their eyes. The Wyoming landscape rushed by in a blur of silver moonlight and black shadow. Behind them, the pursuit organized. A dozen riders peeled away from the burning ranch, their torches looking like a stream of angry fireflies chasing them across the plains. The ground began to change. The rolling grass gave way to jagged rock and deep fissures. This was the Badlands, a broken piece of earth where cattle broke their legs and men lost their souls. "My horse is blowing!" Marion cried out after 3 miles of hard galloping. "Push her!" Jed commanded. "We just need to make the ridge!" A bullet whined past Jed's ear, a sound like an angry hornet. They were getting within range. The posse had fresh horses, and they were closing the gap. "They're shooting at Lily!" Marion screamed, terror edging her voice. Jed slowed his horse slightly, dropping behind the women. He turned in the saddle, raising the Winchester with one hand. It was an impossible shot from a galloping horse in the dark, but Jed didn't need to hit a man. He needed to create chaos. He fired 3 rounds at the ground in front of the lead pursuers. The bullets struck the rocky trail, sending up sparks and stone fragments. The lead horse spooked, rearing violently and throwing its rider. The 2 horses behind it collided with the fallen animal. It was a tangle of limbs and dust that bought them a precious minute. "Up here!" Jed guided them onto a narrow goat path that wound up the side of a steep mesa. The horses scrambled for footing, stones clattering down into the darkness below. It was a treacherous climb. One slip meant death. But the danger worked in their favor. The posse below had to slow down to single file. They crested the ridge and dropped down into the bowl of the Devil's Anvil. It was a geological oddity, a massive, circular depression surrounded by high, sheer cliffs on 3 sides. Massive stone pillars rose from the ground like jagged teeth. It looked like the ruins of a giant's castle. "Stop," Jed ordered, pulling his heaving horse to a halt behind a cluster of boulders. "We're cornered," Marion said, sliding off her horse. Her legs gave out, and she sat hard in the dust. "There's no way out the back. Why did you bring us here?" Jed dismounted, his face grim. He began pulling the rifles from the saddle scabbards of the stolen horses. "Because out there on the flat, they run us down in an hour. Here the ground fights for us." He tossed a Spencer carbine to Marion. "You know how to use this?" "Yes," she said, checking the magazine. "Good. Take Lily. Go up into those rocks." He pointed to a high shelf of granite, about 50 feet up the cliff face. "It's a sniper's nest. Keep your head down. Don't fire until I say." "What are you going to do?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Jed pulled 2 boxes of ammunition from his satchel and began laying them out on a flat rock. He looked at the narrow entrance to the canyon, a choke point only wide enough for 2 riders abreast. "I'm going to teach them a lesson about geography," Jed said. "This is the anvil, and they're about to be the hammer." He walked to the canyon entrance, dragging a dead log across the path. It wouldn't stop them, but it would make them look down, and looking down was fatal. From the distance, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. The posse was cautious now, moving slowly. They knew they had their quarry trapped. They didn't know that the quarry had teeth. Jed settled in behind a boulder, the cold stone pressing against his cheek. He checked the wind. He checked the light. He felt the old, cold familiarity of battle settle over him. He wasn't a rancher anymore. He wasn't a grieving father. He was Sergeant Vance of the 2nd Cavalry, and he was holding the line. The moon drifted behind a cloud, plunging the Devil's Anvil into a heavy grey. Jedediah watched the canyon, mouth through the sights of his Winchester. He had positioned himself at ground level, creating a deadly crossfire with Marion, who waited high on the rocks with the Spencer carbine. Sheriff Brady and Dutch arrived at the entrance, flanked by 15 hired guns. "Vance," Brady shouted, "we know you're in there. Give us the girl and the woman, and maybe you walk away alive." "Talk is cheap, Dutch," Jed yelled back from the shadows. "Come and get them." Dutch sneered and signaled 3 riders forward. As they galloped into the narrow pass, Jed fired 3 rapid shots, not at the men, but at the rocks near their heads. Ricochets screamed, and the horses panicked in the confined space, throwing one rider and forcing the others to retreat in chaos. "Hold fire!" Dutch screamed. Realizing a direct assault was suicide, he rode forward alone, hands up. "Parley, man to man." Jed kept his rifle leveled. "Speak your piece." "You're fighting a losing battle," Dutch called out, lighting a cigarette to feign boredom. "Marion killed her husband. She shot Big Jim right in the gut. We just want justice." From the cliffs, Marion's voice rang out. "He was beating Lily. I only fought back." "She used a pistol," Jed interrupted, his voice cutting through the canyon. "But a 45 to the gut is a slow death, Dutch, unless someone hurried it along with a shotgun." Dutch froze. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying," Jed shouted, "that you killed the only witness to your coup. Marion fled with a pistol, but I bet the coroner found buckshot." "I saw the body," Sheriff Brady shouted from the back, his voice wavering. "He was shot close range with a shotgun, Dutch. You said Marion did that with your gun." "She stole it," Dutch yelled, sweat beading on his forehead. "I never touched your shotgun, Dutch," Marion cried. The sheriff hesitated, his hand drifting toward his pistol. The story wasn't adding up. "Shut up!" Dutch roared. He drew his weapon with blinding speed, but not on Jed. He fired point blank at the sheriff. Boom! Amos Brady was blown out of his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. "Vance killed the sheriff!" Dutch screamed at his confused men. "Kill them all! No witnesses!" The canyon erupted into chaos. Dutch dove behind a rock as the posse opened fire. Marion fired down from the cliffs, dropping a rider, but the volume of fire forced her down. "Flank him!" Dutch ordered. "Get up the rocks! Drag that woman down!" 3 men dismounted and began scrambling up the scree toward Marion and Lily. Jed popped up to cover them, firing with rhythmic precision. Lever, aim, fire, dropping 2 men. But then, the ominous click of an empty chamber echoed. He was out. "He's dry," Dutch roared, charging from his cover, gun raised. "End of the line, old man." Jed fumbled to load his last 3 rounds as Dutch closed the distance. It was over. Suddenly, a rumble shook the ground. A heavy stagecoach thundered into the canyon entrance, drifting sideways to block the exit. On the driver's bench sat Judge Henry Thorne, and beside him, U.S. Marshal Davis, holding a double-barreled Greener shotgun. The cavalry hadn't arrived. The law had. But Dutch was too far gone. Ignoring the marshal, he raised his gun at Jed's chest, eyes wide with madness. "Die!" Dutch screamed. Jed didn't flinch. He exhaled, levered his fresh round, and squeezed the trigger. The canyon echoed with the thunder of the shot, a singular, final punctuation mark to the night's violence. Dutch jerked backward, his revolver spinning away into the dust. He hit the ground hard, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with the realization of his own mortality. Silence crashed back into the Devil's Anvil. The 888 men, who moments ago had been climbing the rocks like wolves, froze as they looked at the smoking barrel of Jedediah's Winchester, and then at the heavy stagecoach, blocking the exit, where U.S. Marshal Davis stood with his shotgun leveled. "Drop them!" Marshal Davis bellowed. "Every gun in the dirt, now!" The fight drained out of the hired guns instantly. Hands went up, and weapons clattered to the stone floor. As deputies swarmed the canyon to cuff the gunman, a small voice cried out from the cliffs. "Jed!" Lily and Marion scrambled down the goat path, running past the marshal, straight to the old rancher. Lily hit him with the force of a cannonball, burying her face in his dusty coat. Marion was right behind her, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "You're alive!" she sobbed. "Hard to kill a bad habit," Jed wheezed, patting Lily's hair with a shaking hand. Judge Henry Thorne climbed down from the stagecoach, looking at the carnage and then at Jed. "You cut it close, Jedediah." "You took your time, Henry," Jed retorted. "We had to be sure," the judge said, gesturing to where the marshal was kneeling over a gasping Dutch. "We exhumed Jim Coulter's body. Marion told the truth. He wasn't killed by a pistol. He was killed by double-aught buckshot at point-blank range." Marion gasped. "Dutch! He finished the job to frame you and steal the 888, the judge confirmed. Dutch played everyone, but his luck just ran out." As the deputies dragged Dutch away, the villain's eyes met Jed's for a fleeting second, no longer arrogant, just empty. The ride back to the rocking V was somber, guided by the rising sun that painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant streaks of pink and gold. When they crested the final ridge, the devastation became clear. The cabin was gone. Only the stone chimney stood, a black finger pointing at the sky amidst a smouldering pile of ash. Marion pulled her horse to a stop, horrified. "Oh, Jed." "You're home." Jed stared at the ruin. He had built that house for Martha. He had raised Sarah there. But as he looked at the wreckage, he felt a strange lightness. The ghosts that had haunted those hallways were gone, released by the fire. "It was just wood," Jed said softly. "Wood and stone." He looked at Lily, safe and alive beside him. "We can build another one, a bigger one, with a room for a little girl." Marion looked at him, hope warring with disbelief. "We? Well," Jed grunted, a small smile cracking his weathered face. "Someone has to run the 888 now, and I suspect you'll need a foreman who knows how to handle wolves." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Jed sat on the porch of the new house, a sturdy 2-story structure raised by neighbors from miles around. Inside, he could hear Marion laughing as she cooked dinner. In the yard, Lily was riding the bay gelding, her laughter ringing like a bell. She trotted the horse over, grinning. "Watch this, Grandpa Jed." Jed smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his steel-colored eyes. "I'm watching, kid." The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the ranch in a golden glow. Jedediah Vance had opened his door to a stranger and lost his house in the process. But in the ashes, he had found something he thought was gone forever. He had found a family. And for the first time in 10 years, the gun on his mantle stayed cold, and the old rancher finally slept in peace. The ashes of the rocking view didn't mark an end, but a beginning. Jedediah Vance proved that a home isn't made of logs and stone. but of the people you're willing to fight for. In the Wild West, where law was often just a suggestion, true justice came from the courage of one man who refused to look away when trouble knocked. Dutch and his men learned the hard way that you never corner a man who has nothing to lose, because he might just find something to live for. If this story of grit, redemption, and frontier justice moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What would you have done if you were in Jed's boots? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another tale from the untold history of the West. Thanks for watching.